Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Senate Democrats Breakout. I want to thank you all for coming today. By way of introduction, if we haven't met or if you're not sure who I am, my name is Kyle Kameen. I am Citizens Climate Lobby's Manager of Stakeholder Engagement and Government Affairs. I have been here with CCL on the Government Affairs team for a little over a year and a half now, not quite 2 years, but more than a year and a half. My role predominantly focuses on kind of the coalition building side as we engage with Congress, looking at associations, industries, businesses, and others that we can engage to coordinate on messaging, share meetings, et cetera, intelligence, et cetera, to move the ball forward on our climate priorities, our shared climate priorities. I'm here today to talk to you about the Senate Democrats Breakout. You might be wondering why we have this specific set of breakouts and not, maybe 3 different categories for the Senate Democrats and 3 for Senate Republicans, et cetera. And really, it just comes down to, we could slice and dice this 1,000 different ways, but there is a point of diminishing returns. And so we tried to sit back and think about, what does it make the most sense for our volunteers and how to break out the engagement, and how can we structure that best? And this is where we landed. So this is obviously the first time we're doing it this way, but we hope you find it valuable, and we're really glad to have you joining us today. So with that, I'm going to dive into our topic of the day a little bit, the Senate Democrat Conference. So, Senate Democrats, as a rule, are going to be pretty open on bipartisan climate solutions and open to supporting climate legislation that comes to the floor. For example, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Project, our bill package, also known as Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And as Senator Whitehouse said, at one point there were 49 senators ready to support a carbon price. Obviously, that was in a different time before, the current energy price situation, et cetera. But we know that as a conference, Democrats were that close to getting on board with a carbon pricing scheme as a part of the reconciliation package back in the fall. So, I think that we can take solace in the fact that Democrats are really looking at policy and engaging as best they can to move the ball forward. And we can take some solace in the fact that there have been some climate wins so far in the Senate, although obviously we want to try and achieve a lot more. However, generally we want to think of Senate Democrats as kind of 3 subsets on climate. About 10 to 15 senators that are, leaders on climate, who will actively seek out opportunities to introduce bills and opportunities to, collaborate across climate policy areas. Some examples of that, I think we see as allies on CCL policies a lot. Senator Whitehouse, Senator Coons, Senator Hickenlooper, and others who, really are trying to be as proactive and take as much action as they can on climate to really try and get a big win across the finish line. There are also probably less than 10 members that we would say are, very progressive members who have policies that, can't really achieve bipartisan support or maybe even a majority support in the Democratic conference, and who may voice opposition at times to against certain policies, but that doesn't mean that they're going to vote against them. Often it just means that it's not their preferred solution. It's not a big enough solution in their mind. It's not the right solution in their mind, but it doesn't mean that they're going to oppose action on climate. It just means that they're not aligned with that specific policy. And at the end of the day, they may still vote to get it across the finish line and have that step as progress, and then try to do more in the future. The remaining members of the Democratic Conference, and so we're talking about 25 members or so, they're really going to support climate legislation when it comes to the floor, and will only lead or voice concern when there's a direct connection to their state. So if something is really good for their state, they may not typically lead on climate, but they're going to come out and talk about why it's a big win for their state. And on the flip side of that, if they feel it hurts their state and they usually don't talk about climate, they may come out and let you know that, listen, this is going to have a negative impact on my state as I see it. And as a result, I've got to be heard about this. What you should take some comfort in is that despite, kind of how we can slice and dice the Senate that way, most CCL messaging We work, the comms team and the government affairs team work closely together to make sure that most of our messaging and grassroots advocacy will be applicable to, the whole conference, that it can be used at any office, and, you might have to, get it just right for them, but that for the majority of it, it is going to be able to be used for any office, and you should, really feel comfortable using what CCL produces to go speak with them. After all that, you might be thinking, what as a volunteer should I be thinking about when working with these members? And you're probably, some of you, hearing in your meeting requests and others that they're already there on climate, and they don't need to be lobbied on climate, and Republicans are the problem, not them. Well, it's important that we understand the moment, right? And right now, reconciliation is still active. In fact, in the last few days, Senator Manchin has made some comments that have kind of breathed new optimism in the hope that they can reach some kind of deal with Senate leadership and Senator Manchin's concerns. But what that means is that many Senate Democrats may have to accept a package that does not include some of their top priorities, and that's going to be a bitter pill. And so it's going to be important that we continue to engage them and say, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. If a reconciliation package can come together that is a big step on climate, we need to get that done. So what messages can resonate with them to get that sentiment across? First, as we always do as CCLers, we want to show our appreciation. They're going to appreciate hearing your thanks and appreciation for what they have done. Affirmation on in LTEs and op-eds and in the meeting, thanking them for there have been growing climate solutions. That was a great success in the Senate, and these other BIF and some of the components of BIF, hearing about these good things that they have done and that they're trying to achieve, and letting them know that we appreciate that effort. The next part of that is, as a general rule, based on our analysis, right, they're not going to need to be convinced to act on climate, but they still need to be held to a standard of ambition. We still want to let them know that this is important. We have to take more action. More must be done. And so, as their constituents, as their tie back to their state, the important thing that you can do is make that emotional connection with them and tell them that it's important to you as a constituent, as a voter, that they continue to make climate ambition a priority. They need to hear from it that it's a priority from you, especially now, because there are so many challenges going on in the world, so many things on a senator's plate every day that seem like a crisis that must be addressed this moment. And climate could get lost in that shuffle if we don't continue to let them know this is important to us, this is important to you as their constituent, as their voter, and that you really need to see them holding climate ambition as a top priority. Beyond that, you're probably thinking something along the lines of, what's our ask or our goal with these members in this meeting? The first thing is that whatever reconciliation looks like, it's going to be important that it meets the president's emissions reduction pledge. As CCLers, we know that emissions reductions are imperative. And so if this is going to be done through reconciliation, we need to be able to tell them it's important that it meets the emissions reduction targets, and you've got to get it across the finish line before the end of Congress. Those are going to be imperatives if we're really going to achieve what we need to on climate. And the second piece is that they might not be aware of legislation that is moving or that's been introduced that is climate related. And so they still might need to be pushed to vote on legislation that maybe isn't their first choice. These are our secondary priorities, right? The Forest Act, NCARS, the RISE Act. These are the kinds of things that, as all of this magnitude of problems come to the fore for the Senate and time starts to run out, we need to keep these priorities in front of them, these pieces of legislation in front of them, and let them know that they can do things on climate right now to make progress. And that's going to be essential right now and moving into the next Congress, when there might be a Republican majority in either the House or the Senate or both. And at which time, certainly the legislation that they might have to vote on will not be their number one climate priority, but it could still be climate progress. And it's going to be important that we encourage them to remain ambitious on climate. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. I hope this was helpful. I know that you probably have a ton of questions that I didn't have the opportunity to cover in my time here right today, but thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the conference virtually from home, and we appreciate all you do to support us as a CCL volunteer. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, or morning, or evening, whatever it may be when you're watching this. I'm Ben Pendergrass. I'm CCL's Senior Director of Government Affairs, and welcome to the Senate Republican Breakout session at this year's June conference. First, a little background on why we're doing this. Traditionally, we've had regional breakouts, but as we work to help you become more effective advocates, it occurred to us that what type of member of Congress you have might be a better way to break out into groups. So hopefully these breakouts will give you some new perspectives and tools for working with your type of member of Congress. I understand if you believe your senator is really different than all the other Republican senators, and we have 6 breakout sessions at this conference. There could have easily been many more, but for our purposes, these segments should work for a majority of the volunteers in each one. So let's start with just kind of a general broad overview of where Senate Republicans are right now. Most Senate Republicans believe that climate change is real and driven by human activity. They are open to federal action to address it, and they are willing to support bipartisan action like the Growing Climate Solutions Act, the Use It Act, the BEST Act, and other bipartisan bills of this type, especially if it's not a direct attack on the fossil fuel industry or some type of mandate. Right now, there are probably 5 to 10 Senate Republicans who really view climate as a priority and will be the members most likely to develop and introduce bills on their own and with Democrats. There are also 5 to 10 Republicans who unfortunately will likely oppose any action on climate unless it directly benefits a constituent industry or has a tie directly to their state. The other Senate Republicans will be somewhere in between, and how they view any particular climate or clean energy bill will largely be determined by the specific policy issue in question. For the most part, though, CCL Republican messaging and grassroots advocacy guidelines will be applicable to the whole Senate Republican Conference. So generally, what should you be thinking about when you're trying to work with these members? In the near term, a focus on the supporting asks. These are really things that a lot of these Senate Republicans should be able to get behind, and we need to put a lot of effort into getting them there. Just because these are things they should be able to support doesn't mean that they will without the efforts of great grassroots advocates like you and CCL generally. This is reflected in our guidance to you on the primary ask sheet for Senate Republicans, and Danny talked about it in his CCU leading up to the conference. Right now, we hope in the next month or so, Democrats will pass a reconciliation bill with strong climate provisions. And Republicans really don't have a role in this process, but they can play an important role in advancing these other important supporting asks that will continue to build a foundation for greater action on climate in the future. In an effort to understand where a lot of these senators are, I recommend taking a look at the American Energy, Jobs, and Climate Plan that was put forth by Senators Sullivan, Kramer, and Lummis. It's an outline for how Senate Republicans are thinking about climate and clean energy, and really could provide some insight into where there could be bipartisan cooperation in the near future. It's important to remember we have seen Senate Republicans move on climate. They overwhelmingly voted for the Growing Climate Solutions Act. 19 supported the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which had strong climate provisions. And they advanced other clean energy and climate action as part of the 2020 Omnibus Bill when they were in the majority. Therefore, we believe it is really important to create a positive feedback loop for getting them to walk faster in the direction of greater climate action. We want climate action no matter what party is in power, and a good way to achieve this is to acknowledge when progress is made and give credit where credit is due. But remember, keep in mind, even though we are seeing real progress and we want to see more progress, we still shouldn't expect them to vote and act like Democrats when it comes to climate. Well, what kinds of messages are best and will resonate the most with these members? We all know that the type of message and framing of an issue is important. Well, first off, don't hesitate to talk about the importance of meaningful bipartisan climate action with this group as a whole. They're not going to be resistant to that message. But it is also really important to talk directly, to tie action directly back to addressing local impacts of climate change in their states. A pro-business message will still resonate with this group, particularly if it is focused around an industry in their state. And lastly, that taking action on climate is beneficial to American competitiveness and energy independence on the global stage. One thing you want to stay away from is messaging that explicitly pits clean energy against fossil fuels or new jobs against old jobs, etc. You've probably heard them utter the words, all of the above a lot, and that is where they are. They're willing to support clean energy, but not exclude existing energy sources. Well, in this moment in time, what are our asks and goals with these members? As I said before, a good place to start is the supporting asks, particularly the Forest Act and the National Climate Adaptation Resilience Strategy Act, or NCARS. We know we need to address global deforestation and protect some of the most important natural carbon sinks we have. We also need to know that the federal government needs to be taking climate into their decision-making across all of federal government, and NCARS would do that, and the Forest Act would be applicable to the first challenge. So these are very important bills. Long term, we want them thinking about the implications on US trade as more global economies adopt carbon prices and border adjustments. You might have noticed several Republican senators are thinking and talking about these issues already. We want more of them to be doing the same. We also need to get as many of these members to a no vote on bad climate legislation. We need to prevent the repeal of any climate progress that we make now in future Congresses, and this really will be of great importance over the next decade. No matter who holds the reins of power, we need to make sure we have a strong bipartisan coalition that will block any effort to move us backwards on climate. Every positive step we take on climate legislation makes the next one easier. We want to continue working toward a world where Democrats and Republicans are both working to advance solutions that reduce emissions and draw greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, as well as build the low carbon economy we know we need. Senate Republicans, I think, can be our partners in this drive. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video and all the work you do for CCL. We couldn't do it without you. And if I didn't get to see you at this year's June conference, I certainly hope to see you in the next.
Welcome to the Insider's Guide to House Progressive Democrats. I'm your host, Amy Bennett, Director of Congressional Liaisons and Lobby Days, and with me is Keston Bazinovich, CCL's Liaison Coordinator. Our goals for today are to leave you with a clear view of how to work with progressive Democrats in the House within the current state of politics. We'd like to help you understand the primary ask and the opportunities for progress in reconciliation. We'd like to advance your skills to work with your member of Congress by understanding the district, the member's concern, and what messages resonate. We also want to help you clarify your strategy and goals for your lobby meeting and how you can strengthen your relationship with your member of Congress. Now, in the past, we have actually divided up Congress into segments and have particular asks depending on your profile. We're just being more intentional about it this time. So the 6 segments we're working with are Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans, the one for this session, House Progressive Democrats, House Populist Republicans, House Rank and File Democrats, and House Moderate Republicans. An important part of our work building relationship and trust with members of Congress and their offices are that we're able to keep the standard of confidentiality. I just want to take a moment to remind you all to please make sure the information shared in your meeting stays confidential and don't specifically share member information during the conference or in breakout or training sessions. Please keep your statements general regarding your members. So what about House Progressive Democrats? They support larger government. They support expanded safety nets. They focus on economic, social, and racial inequality. And as a group, they're very committed to federal action on climate. They prioritize climate. They also prioritize environmental justice policies on climate and the environment. Now, they may oppose policies if the policies don't go far enough. Also, most of these members of Congress are on the House Progressive Caucus. What considerations do you have with progressives? Well, they already feel they're leaders on climate, so they don't really feel they need to be lobbied on it. They often have frustration, not just with Republicans, but with rank and file or moderate Democrats. And if it's not in line with progressive values, bipartisan action is not always a priority and can be viewed negatively. Some other considerations for you: ask yourself, who are the stakeholders, people or groups in your district? Who influences the member? Who do they listen to? And who does the staff listen to as well as the member? What are the unique demographics or makeup of your district? While the staffers and the members can't really talk about elections in lobby meetings, you do want to be aware of the election process and the other candidates and whether or not the primary has happened or if they're going on to the general election. Also ask yourself, what could you or your chapter be doing more of with the member to work better with the member? And if you don't know, ask the member, ask the staffer. They often have some great ideas. Other places to do research are the candidate's website, your member of Congress, if he's running for re-election or her, check their website and the endorsement page. You can check congress.gov to find out what bills your member has introduced. And also keep in mind that candidates can adjust some of their public statements after the primaries. And Keston, over to you.
Thank you, Amy. So now that we've gone over an overview of House Progressive Democrats, we're going to talk about the primary ask. The primary asks that we make provide the context for the work that we do with our members. And since we have our members broken up by segments now, this is a very useful table to refer to that just shows what is the primary ask for the member that you're working with. In that case of House Progressives, our primary ask for this June is help America meet President Biden's climate pledge. Now, I know that this may seem like a broad ask, so we're going to go through all the parts that are associated with it. Now, first, what is President Biden's climate pledge? You may also hear to this referred as the US's National Determined Contribution, or NDC. And this is the commitment that President Biden made to reduce US emissions by 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. Now, in our current political landscape, the reconciliation process still remains our last best chance to accomplish this goal. And working through the reconciliation process has been more challenging than any of us had hoped for, but the public saliency is there. Polling shows that Americans are more concerned about climate change than ever before. And specifically for House Progressives, we want to highlight that this is a problem that only Congress can solve. It's how we ensure lasting climate action, especially with the current makeup of the Supreme Court. And we want to make sure that progressives know we can't rely solely on executive action or regulations. So Congress must act if we want to meet the pledge that President Biden has set forth. Now let's talk about why this is appropriate for House progressives. This is where their heads are at. They've spent virtually this entire Congress within the reconciliation headspace. And since this is an election year, election chances are dependent on legislative wins. And in the minds of Democrats, legislative success is synonymous with passing reconciliation. And where we come in is that progressives need constituent voices to make sure they refocus on climate, along with all the other priorities they're trying to meet through reconciliation. So just to think through some pushback that you might expect when meeting with your members, something that they might push back with is that it's not big enough. And our response in this case is that the climate provisions of the reconciliation package would be the biggest investment we've ever made in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We need congressional action. Regulations alone will not get this done, and we need you, our member of Congress, to get this over the finish line. And we do just want to take some time to address why carbon pricing isn't more prominent in the primary ask this time. And it's really because the high energy prices that we're seeing now are effectively a carbon price. And I do want to note that we want to think about this as a carbon price only internally. This is not something that we want to highlight to our members of Congress. But the reality is that it diminishes our opportunities for influence at this moment with our legislators. And even though here we're working with House progressives, when we look at the big picture, we need to make sure we're motivating action in both parties on climate right now. What messages resonate with our House progressives? As we've mentioned, climate is already a top priority for them, so we can appreciate what they've already done on climate. They are concerned with bold, meaningful action that addresses long-standing inequities, highlight that the US has a responsibility to be an international leader on climate. And they're also concerned with holding bad actors accountable. So, what's our strategy to reach this goal? Although we're working within specific segments when thinking about our members of Congress, we do want to highlight that every member is a unique person that has a unique district and is working with unique stakeholders. We also want to plan ahead to find common ground in our meetings, to come with personal stories about climate change that resonate with our members, and to have open-ended questions prepared that build trust and address concerns. We also want to connect the importance of meeting Biden's pledge to the big climate picture, but also considering the local needs for our districts. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Amy to talk about our final thoughts.
Thank you, Keston. Well, for a few final thoughts, I want to emphasize that this primary ask meets the opportunity at this moment in time, and it also looks to the future. So what we're asking is that you use what you know about House progressive Democrats, along with what you know about who and what influences your member of Congress. And while as CCLers, we're always politely persistent, always be sure to be a needed resource for your member's office. A few last tips. It's always great to have well thought out and extra open-ended questions that will direct the conversation in a very helpful way. So here's a couple of ideas. Climate change is the issue I'm most concerned about. I was pleased to see President Biden set a goal of 50% reductions of emissions below 2005 levels by 2030. Mr. Congressman or Ms. Congresswoman, what local climate impacts are you most concerned about? And what climate policies will you prioritize in Congress to enable our country to reach the president's goal? I also think it's great to emphasize wherever you can find an agreement with your member to verbalize that you have common ground. Use your active listening skills, clarify questions, restate what you think you heard, and ask, tell me more. And lastly, again, create your meeting goals based on your member and your district. Thanks so much for joining us, and good luck in your lobby meetings.
Richter, and I'm CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs. What follows is the talk I'll be giving at the 2022 June Conference Breakout section focusing on House Populist Republicans. So let's begin with a bit of introduction here. Why are we doing segments? Well, the desire here was to be more effective and strategic when thinking about what asks we want to make of our members and how to pitch that ask. We think that this will help you optimize the tension we always have between building the relationship and pushing members to climate action in line with the science. Just want to sound a note about confidentiality for those of you that will be in breakouts. Remember, what is said in the lobby meeting is said in confidence, so please don't share that with the group, but feel free to share information that is publicly available about your member. This segment, the House Populist Republicans, is perhaps the segment around which CCL volunteers have the most anxiety about with respect to being able to move your member forward on climate. To address that, I want to remind you of something we say from time to time about what lobbying success looks like with the toughest cases. For hard cases, it's not about moving them from being opposed to being champions. It's about moving them from being opposed to being on the fence. We don't need to move them all the way in one meeting to be the champion. We just need to move them onto the next step of the ladder of political will. So now let's talk about House Populist Republicans. These members are highly critical of government, seeing most actions as wasteful and inefficient, and they are highly critical of our economic system as a whole, believing it is flawed, unfairly favoring powerful interests. This group includes two subsets on climate. Number one, a small group that are members of the Conservative Climate Caucus, and number two, the remaining majority that do not believe in climate change or do not support federal action on the issue. All of these members are often skeptical of climate science and view the left's response as fear-mongering. House Populist Republicans strongly oppose additional federal environmental regulations and mandates, and when these Republicans do engage on environmental issues, they focus on deregulation, energy independence, global competitiveness, and American innovation. Getting these Republicans to vote no to prevent the repeal of climate actions will be of great importance over the next decade. So what should CCL volunteers be thinking about when looking at these members? Well, first of all, these members may or may not believe in climate change, but they often believe that most, if not all, climate policy is putting our nation and our nation's businesses at a disadvantage while restricting personal liberties. They believe climate advocates are often engaging in fear-mongering for the sake of political gain. There is no crisis in their minds, even if there is a problem. The messages that are going to resonate with these members include, number one, messages that focus on strengthening the United States and the global stage. This could look like holding major polluters like China accountable and or leveling the playing field for American businesses. Number two, messages that are going to resonate are going to include innovation, free market principles, protectionism, deregulation, and energy independence as some of the themes that are more likely to lead to a successful meeting. So what is our goal and what is our ask with these members? Well, we are pushing these members to consider the implications on US trade as more global economies adopt carbon prices and carbon border adjustment mechanisms. We are leaning into the messages around strengthening the United States on the global stage, leveling the playing field for American businesses, and innovation in our one-page lead behind. Remember as well that you're most often going to be working with a young staff, not the member themselves. They still work for their boss, meaning they're going to represent their boss's public positions as best they can. Since success is moving them from opposed to being on the fence, remember, you're coming back. When you come back, it will be extremely important that you listen now so that you can respond to the concerns they really have, not the concerns you think they have. Now, let's have a look at the primary ask sheet. Because of the complexity of border carbon adjustments, for this ask only, we also have a companion guide and a companion to the companion guide. I'll talk primarily about the primary ask here, but those other resources are also available on CCL Community on the primary asks page. Just type in primary asks in the search bar and click on the first link. Now, the title of this ask is Help America Win. Have a look at a carbon border adjustment. Here what we're doing is we've used the language of Donald Trump, who is the dominant figure in this part of the American electorate. In the first part of that ask, we highlight recent statements by prominent Republicans in the second sentence. This includes Senators Kramer, Cassidy, Graham, and Romney, as well as Robert Lighthizer, who is President Trump's former trade representative. Why are we doing this? In moral foundations theory, Jonathan Haidt, in his book The Righteous Mind, identifies loyalty as a value that American conservatives prioritize more highly than American liberals. By highlighting these Republicans and their positive positions on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, we reduce or perhaps even remove the concern that the people we're meeting with may have around their loyalty and how that is perceived by others in their party. This first paragraph also takes a more competitive framing, as we previously noticed, because this first paragraph ends with the sentences, America should make the rest of the world pay for their emissions, and we agree. Now, going on to the second paragraph, we state what we believe in, that it will be necessary to have a carbon price to support the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but we really don't want the conversation to get hung up on this point. The second paragraph also highlights how much the rest of the world has already acted on this and how we stand to be isolated and the negative economic and job cost that would result from being isolated on this topic. Remember, when these Republicans do engage on environmental issues, they focus on global competitiveness and American innovation. The third paragraph is really key to understand. We reference a bill to look at, but we are not endorsing that bill. We are not asking them to co-sponsor. We just want them to read the text. Why are we doing this? Well, remember that members really benefit from looking at specific bill text. This is why some of you who've been around a while may have noticed that they ask about bill numbers so much. So we are giving them a bill number to consider without endorsing the bill that we are asking them to look at. It's a thought exercise. Now, what about that bill? Authors of that bill are Representative Peters and Senator Coons, two of the most bipartisan Democratic members in the entire Congress. And even they, it's their bill, do not believe that this bill is WTO compatible. CCL only wants to endorse or support bills that we believe are going to survive a WTO challenge. However, these members, Senator Coons and Representative Peters, introduced this bill to start a conversation with Republicans. And that's what we want to do too. So we want them to look at this idea, and the thought here is that when they think about it, they will like it. If they like it enough, they may conclude that it is worth the price, and we believe that price is a domestic carbon price to survive a WTO challenge. The idea here is that we back into a carbon price by asking populist House Republicans to read this bill. So that's the third paragraph. The fourth and final paragraph focuses again on competition by naming industries the Republicans tend to favor and want to protect. Generally, we are focused on economic and competitiveness issues, not the environment in this primary ask. To the extent that you do bring up your personal concern for the environment, keep it local to the district or state. Frame it as, this is why I care, not as this is why you should care. The most likely points of contention you're going to get from this sector include China, that they're a bad actor, they're the biggest emitter in the world. They prefer innovation, not prices or taxes, and just that they don't like it. So if they bring up China and how they're a bad actor, our response is a CBAM is exactly how we hold China to account. It will make them pay at the border for their pollution. For innovation, a preference for innovation, say that this is exactly why you're excited about this idea. American polluters already pollute less than foreign polluters. Instead of continuing to subsidize foreign goods in the United States for the emissions they create, they should pay a fair and equivalent price to what American polluters are already paying. That price will encourage innovation both in the United States and abroad, thanks to the market. If they say they just don't like it, then suggest that they speak with Senator Kramer, Cassidy, and Graham and ask them what they like about it. So again, that loyalty. And that's it. That's
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Hardy Alms, and along with my colleague Jamari Hartley, we are the Government Affairs Coordinators here at CCL. Today, we're going to be going over rank and file Democrats for this climate advocacy training. Now, first and foremost, we'd like to take care of some housekeeping, starting with a word on confidentiality. An important part of our work with members of Congress is that we are able to keep a standard of confidentiality when it comes to our meetings. Making sure that information which is shared in these meetings stays confidential is important to building trust and maintaining relationships with these members of Congress. We point this out to remind you to not specifically share member information during these breakout and training sessions. Rather, keep to general statements regarding your members or information which is a matter of public record. Next, I'd like to remind you once more of our primary ask for congressional Democrats. This will provide context to the rest of the work we do on this training. CCL's primary ask of Democrats is to help America meet President Biden's climate pledge. Meeting the goal of a 50% reduction below 2005 emissions by 2030 is very important for the climate. With the current makeup of the Supreme Court, we cannot rely on executive action or regulations to help us meet this pledge. Congress must act to accomplish this goal. Lastly, I'd like to set some general parameters for this discussion. Specifically, what are rank and file Democrats and what is their importance when it comes to climate legislation? House rank and file Democrats view federal action on climate change as a top priority. They are eager to support meaningful climate solutions, particularly bipartisan ones. House rank and file Dems typically vote as a bloc on climate policy with their party leadership, which is why we characterize them as rank and file. They hope to address environmental justice concerns through climate action, but this is not their top motivator. There are generally two subsets on climate within the category of rank and file Democrats. The first is a group of members who will actively seek out opportunities to introduce bills and opportunities to collaborate across climate policy areas. The second consists of those who are considered moderate, who have more nuanced positions on climate policy. They will usually support climate legislation when it is brought to the floor, but only after consideration of the impact on their district, industry, agriculture, and American households. These members will usually only lead on climate policies when there is a direct connection to their district. Next, we'd like to address a few questions concerning your work lobbying rank and file Democrats. The first is, what should you, volunteers, be keeping in mind when working with these members? Now, most of these members have been working on climate legislation for some time. Many of them co-sponsor various bills. A lot of these members feel they are already there on climate and don't need to be lobbied on climate action. In their mind, getting Republicans to move on the issue is the problem, not them. Some of these members have a more cautious approach than their Democratic colleagues, concerned about the economic and political impacts of far left aggressive climate policies. These members are the most likely to face a significant Republican challenge in a general election. And I will now let my colleague Jamar Hartley go over the rest of what you need to know.
Thanks, Hardy, for that detailed introduction. Moving on to another big question. What messages resonate with these members? Most of the members in this segment supported the bipartisan infrastructure package and Build Back Better as a priority this past Congress. They will appreciate thank yous and want to hear that they are doing the right thing on climate. Remember, Democrats have pretty much spent all of this past Congress negotiating on the reconciliation process. It feels like we were talking about members of Congress negotiating reconciliation as soon as the new congressional calendar started. It is also important to express the urgency of comprehensive and effective climate action that takes into account the impact on American households and economy. The Democratic campaign success for rank and file members are based upon their legislative success within the halls of Congress. However, there has been so much going on that important legislation such as climate provisions have been lagging behind, which Thanks, Hardy, for that detailed introduction. Moving into another big question, what messages resonate with these members? Most of the members in this section supported the bipartisan infrastructure package and Build Back Better as a priority this past Congress. They will appreciate thank yous and want to hear that they are doing the right thing on climate. Remember, Democrats have spent pretty much all of this past Congress negotiating the reconciliation process. It feels like we were talking about members of Congress negotiating reconciliation as soon as the new congressional calendar started. It is also important to express the urgency of comprehensive and effective climate action that takes into account the impact on American households and economy. The Democratic campaign success for rank-and-file members are based upon their legislative success within the halls of Congress. However, there has been so much going on that important legislation such as climate provisions have been lagging behind. Simply looking up your members' congressional page helps learn their story. It makes you connect with them before they even know. When talking to your members, it is important to know that they genuinely feel that they are not at the center of needing to be convinced. They are already convinced of the effects of climate change and would like to see action. We need to show that rather than preaching to the choir, we're trying to impress upon them the importance of this issue to their constituents. Additionally, they are still open to work on meaningful legislation by moving forward with the reconciliation process and reaching an agreement to meet President Biden's climate goals. These members have a lot more of a chance to change the minds of senators than most congressional sectors. This brings up the overall main ask, which we are going to cover now. What is our ask and goal with these members? Like Hardy mentioned earlier, meeting the goal of a 50% reduction below 2005 emissions by 2030 is very important for the climate. With the current makeup of the Supreme Court, we cannot rely on executive action or regulations to help us meet this pledge. Congress must act to accomplish this goal. It is crucial for us to shore up support from members of Congress to vote for whatever Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema agree on. Even in the slimmed down version, it would still be the biggest climate package ever passed in this country. With upcoming deadlines when it comes to legislation, it is important to let members know that now is the time to act on climate and hold them responsible for future actions. Make an emotional connection with your members of Congress to understand that their constituents continue to want to see action on climate policy. A great way to do this is by sharing stories. Stories are a great opportunity to make yourself memorable to your members of Congress. You want them to remember your name. You want to have urgency. It's good to tell them about a person or a place to kind of resonate that message. You also have to let your member of Congress know that Biden's Paris Agreement pledge needs to be met, and there should be no exception. It is a busy time on the Hill, and it's important to let your members know that climate should be one of their priorities within the coming months. As I mentioned earlier, House rank-and-file Democrats have a lot of incentive to get the reconciliation process finished and get a bill on the floor with substantial climate provisions. It would be a huge win if there is a package on climate, and Democrats would be able to declare victory in saying that they were the ones who worked towards this goal this past Congress. The budget reconciliation process had been the primary way forward for Democrats, but competing priorities and crisis have drawn their attention away from reconciliation, as has the impending election. They will need their constituents, you guys, to refocus their attention on this and remind them how important an opportunity this moment is to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. Thank you, guys.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad to have you here to talk about what my personal favorite type of member of Congress is, the House moderate Republicans. I know it's up for debate, but I would have to say that I think there's been more movement in terms of support for climate policy in this segment than in any other segment of Republicans in Congress. And they are often the ones that are making and breaking some of these climate policies. So let's talk a bit about what makes a House moderate Republican. First, I'm sure many of you have heard this from your members. They firmly believe that climate change is real. And unlike some other Republicans, they believe it's largely driven by human activity. Because of that, they think it must be addressed by federal policy. Not solely federal policy, but they do believe the federal government has a responsibility to take action on this issue. They're keen on market-based and all of the above energy policies. So they're not eliminating any specific source of energy, including fossil fuel and nuclear. They're very supportive of. They want all of the above approach. They're also eager to develop bipartisan climate and environmental solutions. So they're not pushing Republican-only policies, and they're also not pushing, policies that can't get Republican support. They really want to figure out what is going to be that common ground, what's going to be that middle path solution that they can push that's a bipartisan policy. These members are frequently breaking from their own party on a variety of policy issues. You'll see them cross over, and there'll be 3 Republicans that support this Dem bill or something like that. They're either going to get blasted in the media for it, or they're going to get highlighted and praised in the media for it. One way or another, they are breaking from their own party and breaking the mold, including, in terms of climate policy, supporting stringent environmental regulations and mandates. That's typically the policies where they will break from their party. So we'll see things like clean air policies, clean water policies that Republicans are either trying to repeal if they're in control of Congress, or Democrats are trying to advance. And these moderate Republicans will often break from their party in support of those regulations and mandates if they think they are sound, based on science, and really serve their district. There's roughly 30 to 35 House moderate Republicans, and most of them are all members of the Tuesday Group Caucus. It's been renamed to be called the Republican Governing Group Caucus, but Tuesday Group is the name that most people know it by. It's been called that for many, many years. They're frequently working with Democratic members, as I mentioned, to develop this bipartisan climate legislation. But their angle, their bent, the way they get to that is they're always addressing a specific issue in their district. Most often, they're taking something that's happened locally, whether it be a natural disaster, a jobs issue, or something else that's happened locally that's impacting their constituents that has a climate nexus, and they're using that as a means, as a starting point to start those bipartisan discussions and work on climate policy. So now that we know a bit about who these members are, what defines them, let's talk about what we should be thinking about when we're working with them. You know who they are, what defines them. So what are the subtleties that you should be aware of as you're interacting with them? They're often criticized on both sides, on climate and almost every issue. The far left on climate is thinking they do not do enough. And the far right thinks these House moderate Republicans are going way too far. So they're getting beat up from both sides, no matter what they do. They're most often addressing climate change through local impacts, like we discussed. So we really need to hone in on what is happening in their district. What are the local concerns that they have going on? They're hearing from constituents, they're working on, they're holding events on, town halls on. What are those issues? And is there a climate nexus? How can we relate those to climate? Or maybe the members already relating it to climate, and that's how we start this conversation. That's how we get a better foot in the door. House moderate Republicans hold the most competitive Republican seats in the House, and they're the most likely to face a significant Republican primary challenger and a Democratic challenger in the general. So most Republicans are not worried about the general election. They just have to get through that primary where they're facing a Republican. These moderate Republicans have 2 really difficult elections. They have to get through their primary election, where they have to figure out how to appeal to conservatives, how do they get their base on board, and then in the general, they need to come back and they need to win over independent voters, they need to win over potentially swing Democratic voters, they need to win that general too. And this is important, especially during an election year, for us to be aware of. Now, at the same time, I need to make an important note here that when you go into these lobby meetings, while this is great subtext to understand the political dynamics your member is facing, it is not something you should be bringing up. You shouldn't mention it to staff. You shouldn't mention it to the member. There's a really firm, clear line between official member of Congress staff and office responsibilities and duties, and their campaign. We are not allowed to talk about elections, politics, polling in terms of how they're doing in their election, or anything like that in a member of Congress's office, in emails with official staff, anything like that. If there's something specific to a campaign, that would be directed to their campaign staff and to the member of Congress in a campaign specific function. So just be aware that as important as this information is for us strategically to bring the right messages, to make sure we're making asks that make sense given the time of year and what's going on with our member, it's not something we want to directly address with our member in these official meetings and settings. So now we have a better idea of who these members are. What should we be thinking about when we're meeting with them? Let's talk a bit about what should we be saying? What messages really resonate with these members? One, because like I said, they've led on climate. They're the Republicans that have done the most on climate are these House moderate Republicans. We really want to appreciate them for what they've done. They're getting beat up by the left for doing too little and beat up by the right for doing too much. So how can we be that voice in the middle that's telling them you're doing a great job? We appreciate all of these things that you're doing. Immediately, that's going to make us stand out. Everyone else is criticizing them. They need that support. They need that middle ground for someone to step out and really show them that we appreciate what they're doing and we want to continue to have them move in that direction. So immediately that builds trust and it really shows them that we are an ally to them. We want to work with them on this, not work against them. It's also important for us to highlight the importance of bipartisan climate action. So instead of saying, you know, we're pushing reconciliation, obviously they're not working on reconciliation. They're not going to vote for that. We're also not focusing on a Republican only solution. We're thinking about how can we bring these two sides together to come up with bipartisan solutions in this space. We also want to focus on those local impacts. So that's where doing the research on your member, figuring out what's going on in the district really comes in handy. Either they've already drawn the connection between local flooding and climate, or you can draw that connection for them and see, does that resonate with them? Can I bring up this local issue, relate it to climate, and does the member seem to engage better when I do that? They also are pro-business. These Republicans care about industry. They want to make sure their small and medium-sized businesses are playing fairly on a global stage. We want to make sure they have equal footing with all of these other companies. So it's important to think about the industry perspective. And in the similar vein, they really care about American interests on the global stage. So thinking about these polluters like China and Russia, and the fact that America has cleaner energy in comparison, how can we highlight that? How can our policies drive that message forward and really support American interests on the global stage? And lastly, we really don't want to highlight any messages that are explicitly pitting clean energy against fossil fuels. You know, far too often we're trying to advance clean energy. I say we as just a general term for, you know, the environmental community. We're trying to advance clean energy at the expense of fossil fuels. And while that's a meaningful and worthwhile strategy, for these members, that is not a winning message. We want to be aware of, like I said, they want an all of the above energy approach. So we don't want to say we want to get rid of fossil fuels or get rid of nuclear. We just want to talk about what we want to advance. We want to advance clean energy. We want to talk about renewables, and these members are going to be on board with that. So now we've got a good idea of the messages, the kind of tone we should be using. What's our actual ask? What's our real goal as we go into these meetings? Well, one, we want to continue to push these members to take bolder action on climate while being realistic. That's where it comes in handy to understand what are the political ramifications, what's happening in the district, and what's happening with their election. We want to ask them to take bolder steps, to take bigger actions, but we also don't want to ask them something that we know is an inevitable no from them. We want to really engage them on things that are realistic, that are possible and feasible for them. We also want to demonstrate that there's local support for bipartisan climate action and provide cover. So like I said, they're getting beat up from both sides. There's no one in the middle clamoring for them to do more things in that space in the middle in terms of climate action, and they're not receiving that support. So they take a step on climate and they're getting beat up by the right, they're getting beat up by the left. So how can we demonstrate that there is local support for that, that they're not just going to get beat up no matter what they do on climate? They're going to get praise, they're going to get support locally. That's what we need to help develop and drive. And specifically for our June Lobby Day, our official ask is to support one of our supporting asks. So we want to pick a supporting ask that suits their region or their constituency. Are they a more rural member? Are they not on the Growing Climate Solutions Act, even though they have a pretty big ag constituency? That might be the best ask. Do they have a lot of forest land or cattle maybe in their district? In that case, maybe the Forest Act is a good ask. Or the National Climate Adaptation and Resilience Strategy Act. It's a more broad, overarching supporting ask that focuses on what the federal government can do. All of these asks are going to be meaningful, and most moderate Republicans are gettable on all of these different asks. We just need to figure out how to cater them to the specific member, what makes the most sense. And every positive step on climate legislation makes the next one easier. So as we knock down these supporting asks and we get these moderate Republicans to do more on climate, it's going to be easier and easier as we go forward. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me, to learn more about House moderate Republicans, and to really give this some meaningful thought on how to engage with these members, given the position they're in, who they are, and what's meaningful to them. I'm confident that it's going to make a tremendous amount of progress in your relationship with your member, and ultimately the success in making sure our asks are met. So thank you so much.